I'm going to ask you a semi-controversial question. I'm curious what your answer would be. So, what does Clem think about large language models? Should they be open? And philosophically, when companies like OpenAI argue that the some of the models might be too dangerous. How do you think about that whole statement?
Yeah, I think they should be safely open, because if you look at kind of like the underlying ethical reasoning, so part of the Hugging Face team, we have someone called Irene Soleiman, who was actually at OpenAI before and led the release of GPT-2 in open source at OpenAI before, who was one of the worldwide experts in terms of safety of releases of models. And when you look at the theory behind it, and when you try to avoid risks, you actually realize that open sourcing, open releasing, and kind of like being transparent and inclusive with these models is actually safer for humanity in the long term. An intuitive way to understand that is that by not releasing, not open sourcing, you actually create very big challenges in terms of concentration of power. And you end up with organizations who are able to build, understand models, which are usually, big tech or big companies. And then you have the rest of society who is not able to understand and then control this, right? You end up with public organizations, with governments unable to understand and create regulation that makes sense. You end up with underrepresented populations who are not able to voice their concerns about some of these biases, the biases that you do find in there. So you create a gap, which makes it actually much more dangerous than if you don't have this gap. And that's why, for example, science, right? If you look at science in general, it's always been open and collaborative. Like the scientists, they publish their research papers. It's kind of like integrated by the community and by society, because that's kind of like the safest way to progress technology. Versus kind of like building this behind closed doors and keeping them behind closed doors, where you create this gap of understanding and ability to control between a few organizations that are monopolistic and kind of like keeping control and the rest of society.
This is probably one of those long topics that we could get into, though I have a particular view, which I think is like philosophically aligned with yours, which is why we probably get along well on topics such as these. But I always have tried to summarize this down, which is there's a saying, which is, if you want to put something out into light, you'll understand what's going on, like that sort of thing. But how often have we been burned in the past as society in the world for blindly trusting X, where X is whatever it is? And it's almost a universal truth where if you put your blind faith, trust in X, it bites us, whether that be an institution, a program, a process, or whatever. It doesn't work. And whenever I run into somebody who's having this conversation with me, I'm like, great, like imagine, the IRS is one of these. The IRS is this one massive big black box where you have no idea what's going on inside this thing. You have no idea what's happening. And how often do we get frustrated by this? Now, a lot of people argue that, well, that won't happen in the AI space or the model space because these companies don't have that same sort of structure. I just don't believe it. The history has never once proven that blind faith, trust in X will work out in the long run for humanity. It always degrades. So therefore, our reaction to that as a society that started in code was to open the things so that no one person or one entity can do that. And it just feels like we're having the exact same discussion that we had about open source software 25 years ago, and we're doing it again. But thankfully, people like you exist in the world, and the academic and the scientific community is pushing it forward too.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious, like, how do you see the conversation? Obviously, we're in early days of that conversation. How do you see it evolving over the next, 2-3 years? And more broadly, obviously, the space has just gone through such transformational change this past year. Like, where do you kind of see us in 5 years?
It's an interesting question. We've learned to stop trying to predict things too much because we've been proven wrong so much with the speed of the evolution of the field. It's kind of like an amazing thing. I don't think you've seen in the past a field that is becoming so mature, so mainstream, and still moving so fast at the same time. It creates very, very unique challenges that we haven't seen in the past. I think what we're starting to understand now is that machine learning is a new paradigm to build old tech. Like it's this analogy from Andrej Karpathy, like software 1.0 was like the first paradigm to build software. That's what we've been doing for the past 15, 20 years. Now we're entering a new paradigm, right, which is using machine learning to build old technology. And so I think in 5 years, every single technology company is going to build with machine learning. As a matter of fact, maybe we won't even call it, AI or machine learning then, because it's going to be so ubiquitous and it's going to be really kind of like the default way to build all technology that you won't even need kind of like a name for it.
Right.
But it's
and it
just,
seems like you're starting to see, obviously, a lot of, it seems like even in the last few months post ChatGPT, a lot of, newer industries or folks kind of come and explore use cases. And, I'm curious what then role Hugging Face plays around some of those new use cases. Like, for example, I thought it was really interesting. You hired a machine learning engineer to kind of focus on healthcare and biotech. I'm sure there's lots of different verticals of which are, exploring these models. How do you think about like where you guys play in helping each of those, specific verticals? Is it kind of just community engagement, some set of like tailored products for those markets? How have you been thinking about it?
Well, I mean, the first interesting thing is that we're really seeing the whole field and all the domains getting more homogeneous than they were before. Before it was very siloed, right? You had NLP, you had computer vision, you had audio, you had ML for biology. Now, because technologically speaking, you're starting to use the same architectures for all, right? Namely transformers. You are starting to kind of like break the barriers between all these domains, and that's what we're seeing on Hugging Face with more and more people sharing biology, chemistry, time series models. And our goal as a company is really to provide the right foundational platform for all companies to be able to do this paradigm switch, right, from traditional software to machine learning. And so that means kind of like bringing on the community, right, of researchers sharing models and companies using these models. That means adapting our tools. So, for example, one feature that is very popular on the Hugging Face platform are spaces, right? The ability to create demos very, very easily. And the spaces for, molecule prediction models are going to be a little bit different than the spaces for text generation, right? So we need to adapt and create more capabilities for all these new domains. And then the hardest thing, and actually I think that's the main reason why most of the companies are using our platform, we need to build the right abstractions for it to be future-proof. Right, I think what companies want to do when they use the Hugging Face platform is to make sure that what they build today is not going to be obsolete in 6 months, right? So something we're thinking a lot about is, how do we build the right abstractions, the right tools that are going to be used not only today, not only in 1 year, but in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, so that companies can take advantage of the evolution of the new models, of the new architectures, but at the same time not get lost on them and have to start from scratch over and over again.
How do you think about that? I mean, I'll shamelessly ask, because I think that's such a big question in the space right now. I feel like there's, you have the existing state-of-the-art models, and I feel like so many people are optimizing around, okay, here's how GPT-3 works today. Let me get really good at prompt engineering. Who knows if that's going to be a part of models in 3-5 years? Like, how do you think about, I guess, what are like, no matter what changes happen in the underlying models, these are blocks that are important versus, maybe this is just kind of a moment in time thing that we don't need to focus on as much?
So first you think about it and you make it a priority, much more than in the previous paradigm, I think. And that comes from our heritage of, having started to think about this like 6 years ago now. And for example, if you look at our open source libraries and if you look at like the main maintainers of the libraries and how they reply to comments, how they prioritize the different pull requests, the different issues, they actually talk about this a lot and are doing a lot of trade-offs in terms of like making it like future-proof and stable. Versus jumping on every single trend and breaking everything, making a lot of breaking changes and things like that. Then the second thing is, and I think that's one of the things that made us successful, is having the full range of understanding from very, very specialized science to commercial usage of it. It's something kind of like unusual for startups. I think you don't have a lot of startups that have kind of like these full range of capabilities, and it comes from our history of being 3 founders with like the full scope. But that allows you to have kind of like the long-term science evolution in mind, while at the same time kind of like building for companies and for final use cases. So that kind of like bridges the gap between science to production, which is also something that is a bit different for machine learning than it used to be for traditional software. So these would be I guess the 2 main things. And then the last one is and Jason, you've seen that with GitHub, I'm sure, but when you've started to be this centerpiece for the community, the community itself is helping you a lot on that, right? Because they're keeping you honest. They're telling you when you fuck up what they've been building, when you slow them down. So like relying on the community and being community driven is also like a good way to make sure that what you're doing is useful right now and kind of like future proof for most of your community members.